She thought grief made me blind. She was wrong. That's the first thing you need to know about me. My name is Dr. Leonard Gray, and 8 months after burying my wife, I learned that the real funeral hadn't even started. Because the dead don't betray you, the living do. When Grace died, silence became my only language. The mornings felt heavier, the house colder. I kept her mug by the sink, her handwriting still taped to the fridge. Don't forget to breathe. I thought loneliness was my biggest enemy. But the real danger wore. Perfume smiled sweetly and called me Dad. Her name is Lydia Chen, my daughter-in-law. On camera, she's the picture of family hugging me at church, holding my hand at dinner. But behind that warmth hid something colder than grief. Lydia saw what most people didn't, a widower with savings, a man too broken to notice a signature missing, or a check quietly rerouted. She knew exactly where my weakness lived and she moved in. People call this a family drama. I call it a lesson in quiet revenge, because what started as kindness turned into a psychological thriller inside my own home. While I sat beside my wife's empty chair, Lydia was setting traps, doctor visits, financial assistance, gentle reminders that I was forgetting things. You shouldn't drive alone anymore, Dad, she'd say. Let me take care of the bills. I wanted to believe she cared. Everyone did. That's how betrayal works. It wears love like a mask. But here's what Lydia never knew. I spent 30 years as a Mandarin interpreter at Pacific General Medical Center. I've heard every kind of lie in every language. And when grief took my voice, I learned something powerful. Silence makes liars talk louder. The night I overheard her speaking Mandarin on the phone, calling me the old fool who doesn't understand a word, I didn't get angry. I got ready. I bought a recorder the size of a Zippo lighter and started collecting her truth. Every conversation, every insult, every fake apology became part of my revenge story. In America, people say justice takes time. In my case, it took patience and a quiet smile. Because I wasn't planning to yell or cry or beg. I was planning to listen. This is not just another family betrayal tale. It's a psychological thriller, a story about how grief turns into power when you stop defending yourself and start recording the truth. In the next few minutes, you'll hear how a 70-year-old man branded weak, confused, and irrelevant used silence, intelligence, and a single red recording light to expose everything. So if you think betrayal only happens in dark alleys, think again. Sometimes it starts right at your dinner table with a smile, a lie, and a whisper in another language. This is how I turned silence into justice. This is my revenge. She said she wanted to help me. Those were her exact words the morning she brought over breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, and that overly sweet smile that only liars can perfect. You shouldn't worry about paperwork, Dad, she said softly. I'll handle everything for you. It sounded innocent, even kind. But betrayal rarely arrives screaming. It tiptoes in holding a casserole dish. After Grace's funeral, Lydia became a permanent fixture in my life. She reorganized my pantry, replaced my medication labels with new ones, and even changed the wallpaper on my phone. She said it was to make things easier, but each small favor came with a hidden price control. Control over what I ate, where I went, who I spoke to, and eventually over what I believed about myself. It started with little reminders. You're forgetting a lot lately, Dad. Then came the gentle sighs when I couldn't recall a date or when I misplaced my keys. It's normal at your age, she'd say with that rehearsed sympathy. But I noticed something odd. She never corrected me when I was right. She only reminded me when I was wrong. It was a quiet campaign, a subtle rewriting of my reality. At first, I thought grief was clouding my memory. I'd lost Grace, my compass, my mirror. Some mornings, I woke up expecting to hear her humming by the stove. Maybe Lydia was right. Maybe I was slipping. So I surrendered small things, my mail, my checkbook, my online banking password. It's safer if I handle it, she said. Weeks later at Pacific Bank and Trust, I went to deposit a check from my pension. The teller, Nina Lopez, looked at the screen and hesitated. Dr. Gray, I see a note here. Your account lists a financial representative, Miss Lydia Chen. Would you like her to manage this deposit? I froze. My what, I asked. Nina turned the monitor, slightly revealing a signature I'd never written, wobbly, uneven, obviously forged. Lydia had filed a power of attorney. That night I confronted her. She smiled wide and calm. Dad, you don't remember you signed it at the doctor's office. Dr. Peterson said you were having memory lapses. It's all for your protection. Dr. Peterson, I remembered the visit. I remembered Lydia interrupting every answer speaking for me. I remembered her whispering to him, "He's been a little forgetful, poor thing." I didn't remember signing anything, but I did remember her hand guiding mine that day saying, "Just a small form for your insurance." The next morning I found my car keys missing. I hid them, Lydia said. "You almost drove off without your wallet yesterday." My phone disappeared too. She said I'd misplaced it. Then my mail stopped coming altogether. Lydia had everything redirected to her address to keep track of bills. When my son David came over, she put on her best performance. "Your dad's struggling," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound genuine. "I'm worried about his mind." David looked at me with pity, the kind that burns worse than anger. "Maybe we should look into assisted living," he said quietly. Lydia nodded solemnly, squeezing his hand. "It's for his own safety." That's when I knew it wasn't confusion eating away at me, it was manipulation. A well-designed cage disguised as compassion. Lydia didn't want to care for me. She wanted to inherit me while I was still breathing. Over the next weeks, I noticed how every conversation bent reality slightly in her favor. If I said something she didn't like, she'd respond with concern and not argument. "Are you sure, Dad? You might be mixing things up again." And if David was around, she'd lean closer to him and whisper, "It's getting worse." One evening, she cooked dinner beef stew, Grace's favorite. As we sat down, she poured me a glass of wine and made a toast. To family, she said, smiling, to love. The words tasted like poison. Midway through the meal, her phone rang. She answered in Mandarin, thinking I didn't understand. Her voice changed sharp, mocking. "The old man's useless," she said. "Soon he'll be in care, and the money will be ours." That's when something inside me shifted. My grief hardened into focus. I didn't react. I didn't flinch. I simply looked down at my plate, nodded, and quietly began to plan. I'd spent decades listening to dying patients confess their regrets in Mandarin and English alike. I'd learned that silence, when used correctly, is the sharpest blade in the world. Lydia thought she was building a web. She didn't realize I'd already started recording the strands. Every visit, every phone call, every accidental touch of my signature, I documented it all. I studied her like a research subject. Her manipulation had rhythm, and once I heard the pattern, I could predict her every move. She took over my health too. She told Dr. Peterson I'd been hallucinating. She replaced my prescriptions with simplified doses. I caught her switching my pill bottles once she said she was organizing them. I pretended not to notice. She thrived on control, and the easiest way to control a narcissist is to let them think they're winning. The community saw her as an angel. The church called her devoted. Friends praised her loyalty. That's the brilliance of a liar. They build their halo right before they strike. Lydia began transferring $2,800 a month from my account to a business named Chen Wellness and Home Support LLC, a company that didn't exist anywhere in California's registry. I checked quietly, keeping my findings to myself. Each month her confidence grew. Each smile got wider. Each lie more comfortable. David didn't see it. He was caught in the illusion of a caring wife. I didn't blame him. Love blinds faster than fear. But I began to feel something I hadn't in months' clarity. I wasn't weak and I wasn't confused. I was patient, and patience is the soil where revenge grows best. When Lydia looked at me that night and said, "You need me, Dad," I almost smiled. Because by then I had all I needed: her words, her voice, her greed captured, time-stamped and ready. She thought she was writing my ending, but in truth she was signing the first page of her own downfall. They started calling me sweet old man. It sounded harmless, even endearing, until I realized it was code for not taken seriously. That's how manipulation spreads inside a family, not through anger, but through pity disguised as love. After Lydia gained access to my finances, the real show began. She didn't push too hard right away. No, she preferred theater slow and deliberate, with everyone playing their parts. To the neighbors, she was the devoted daughter-in-law caring for her lonely father figure. To my son David, she was a wife carrying the weight of a family. To me, she was an actress rehearsing a role she'd written herself. And the script was simple: make Leonard Gray look fragile. It started small. She'd stop mid-conversation, tilt her head and whisper, "He's confused again, honey." She did it at church, at restaurants, even in front of the grandchildren. I'd be telling a story and she'd cut me off with a soft apologetic laugh. He repeats things now. Poor Dad, it's the memory. The audience would nod with sympathy, the kind that burns deeper than judgment. Pity is the perfect weapon. No one argues with kindness. The more she spoke, the more people listened to her version of me instead of the truth. When David visited, she made sure the stage was perfectly set. Homemade cookies on the table, gentle background music, a framed photo of Grace freshly polished. Every detail designed to look wholesome, loving, unthreatening. David would sit beside me and ask, "How are you feeling, Dad?" Lydia would answer for me before I could open my mouth. "He's been tired lately. We've had some little mix-ups with bills and appointments, but it's all under control." He'd look relieved and I'd sit there sipping my tea, feeling myself being erased one word at a time. At dinner, she'd serve me smaller portions to make sure I didn't choke. She'd cut my meat before handing me the plate, smiling sweetly like I was a child. "Grace used to love this recipe," she'd say. Then in Mandarin, barely above a whisper, she'd add, "The fool probably doesn't even remember her name." I remembered everything. One Sunday, she hosted what she called a family brunch. It was her masterpiece, my son, the grandkids Ella and Noah, Lydia's parents, Mei Lin and Victor Chen, and her younger sister Ivy. She made pancakes shaped like hearts, set out orange juice, and played nostalgic songs from Grace's favorite playlists. The smell of maple syrup and deceit filled the house. "Dad," she said brightly, "we were talking about helping you simplify things, your bills, your medications, your driving. You don't need to worry about anything anymore." "I'm fine, Lydia." "Of course you are," she said, voice dripping with condescension. "But we just want you safe." Her mother, Mei Lin, chimed in gently. "He should rest more. He's lucky to have you, Lydia." Her father nodded. "In our culture, we take care of our elders. It's the right thing." David smiled, looking at Lydia like she was a saint. I watched his hand rest on hers, saw how he believed every word she spoke. I could almost hear the strings tightening around him too. Then came the accidents. Lydia would misplace documents, then claim I'd lost them. She'd spill coffee on important letters and say I'd knocked the cup over. She'd hide my wallet, then find it under the couch cushion to prove my forgetfulness. Each moment was a carefully placed crack in the foundation of my credibility. Once she walked into the room where I was watching the news and asked, "Why's the TV on, Dad? You were just sleeping." I wasn't. I'd been awake the entire time. But she looked at David and sighed. "He doesn't even realize it." He turned to me helpless and said, "Dad, maybe we should get you checked. It's frightening how fast you can become invisible in your own home." I felt trapped in a play. I didn't audition for every gesture, misinterpreted, every silence turned into proof of decline. Lydia spoke softly, moved gracefully, and smiled constantly. But behind that performance was a predator who understood how to weaponize compassion. One afternoon, I overheard her on the phone again, whispering in Mandarin to her mother. "Everyone believes me now. Even David. Once I move him out of the way, I'll control everything. The old man's practically gone already." I looked around the living room, Grace's framed photos, our anniversary clock, the plants she loved, and realized how carefully Lydia had invaded every inch of my life. She hadn't just stolen my money, she'd stolen my identity. The grandchildren were the only ones who still saw me as myself. Ella would sit on my lap reading, and Noah would ask me questions about stars. But Lydia managed even that. "Don't tire Grandpa," she'd scold them. "He gets confused." Soon they stopped coming as often. My house grew quieter, emptier, like a museum of memories someone else owned. I knew then that love, when used wrong, could be the cruelest disguise. Lydia didn't scream, didn't threaten, didn't raise her hand. She didn't have to. Her control came wrapped in comfort, her lies coated in care. She made me doubt myself, question my own memory, until the world saw me the way she wanted, fragile, helpless, ready to be replaced. The irony, she underestimated the one thing she couldn't manipulate: my silence. Silence, when chosen, is not weakness. It's observation. And I was observing everything. The glances, the whispers, the misplaced papers, the smiles that lasted too long. I memorized her rhythm, because every lie has a pattern and every performance eventually slips. I decided I wouldn't shout, wouldn't fight her in public. That would only feed her story. No, I'd let her believe she'd won. I'd nod when she called me sweet old man. I'd let her serve my meals, hide my keys, steal my words. I'd let her dig her own grave, one act of kindness at a time. Because I'd learned something from years as a translator: the louder someone performs, the more desperate they are to hide the truth. So I waited, patient, quiet, and visible. Let her family worship her. Let the neighbors praise her. Because when the time came when every mask fell and every smile turned brittle, the truth would no longer need my voice. It would have her own, recorded, word for word. And when it played back, the applause would finally stop. Some nights the silence spoke louder than any voice. I'd sit in Grace's old armchair, her favorite blanket still draped across the back, the scent of lavender faint in the air. Grief is a strange thing. It makes the world both louder and emptier. The refrigerator hum feels like thunder. The ticking clock becomes a metronome for loneliness. But what hurt the most wasn't the quiet, it was realizing that the only person who truly saw me was gone, and the one pretending to care was the one tearing my life apart. I miss Grace every hour. I'd still pour her coffee out of habit, stir in 1 spoon of sugar, the way she liked, then catch myself and whisper, "You'd laugh at me for this, wouldn't you?" That laugh used to fill this house like sunlight. But Lydia had managed to make even the light feel suspicious. She had convinced the people around me that my grief had clouded my mind. And maybe for a time it had. In those early months after Grace passed, I was fragile but not broken. Lydia saw fragility as an opening, a weakness to exploit. And for a while I let her, because I couldn't imagine someone so close, someone I'd called family, weaponizing compassion. But the truth has a way of bleeding through even the prettiest lies. It began one night when I found a letter tucked inside Grace's jewelry box. The paper was yellowed, her handwriting looping gently across the page. "Leonard," it said, "if you're reading this, it means I couldn't protect you anymore. Be careful of Lydia." She smiles with her mouth, not her eyes. "The children's future depends on your strength." I read that letter 10 times. My hands trembled, but something inside me steadied. Grace had seen Lydia's shadow long before I did, and suddenly the fog in my head cleared. Grief was no longer a prison, it was a weapon sharpened by memory. That night I stopped crying and started thinking. I began replaying every conversation Lydia had ever had around me. Her soft sighs, her gentle corrections, her pitying tone when she told David he gets so confused now. The dots began connecting in ways I hadn't wanted to see. The missing documents, the restricted access at the bank, the staged forgetfulness, the moment at the doctor's office when she spoke over me. Every memory that had once hurt now became a piece of evidence. I remembered Grace's voice on the hospital bed, thin but fierce. "Don't let them make you small, Leonard. You've spent your life helping people understand one another. Don't let anyone use your kindness as a weapon." Those words became my compass. I realized something crucial. Lydia thought she was the only one acting, but I had been interpreting people for decades, patients, doctors, families in crisis. I'd watched lies unravel in real time. I knew how to read the spaces between words, how to let silence make people uncomfortable enough to reveal themselves. So I chose silence deliberately. I let her believe I was declining. I let her pity me in public, talk over me, translate my confusion into sympathy for herself. Every insult, every manipulation became fuel. Because there's a kind of revenge that doesn't come from anger, it comes from clarity. And clarity requires patience. During those long, sleepless nights, I started to plan. I bought a new digital recorder, hid it in my shirt pocket, and began collecting Lydia's lies one by one. I'd record her phone calls in Mandarin, her whispers about the old fool, her false concern about my safety. Sometimes I'd just leave it on the table and ask innocent questions like, "Did you ever talk to the doctor about my medication?" And she'd answer too quickly, forgetting her rehearsed lines. The recordings piled up like bricks for a quiet fortress. But beyond the strategy, there was the ache, deep, raw, and human. Every time I pressed record, I thought about Grace. I wondered if she'd want me to go this far to turn my mourning into war. But then I'd see Lydia walking through my home, touching Grace's piano, folding my wife's apron as if it were hers, and I'd know the answer. Grace had asked me to protect our legacy, our grandchildren, our dignity. This was no longer revenge, it was defense. I started keeping a notebook. I wrote down every inconsistency in Lydia's story, every date that didn't align, every document she claimed I'd signed. The handwriting helped me think. Each word steadied my pulse. I wasn't losing my mind, I was rebuilding it. Slowly, I began reclaiming my power in ways Lydia couldn't see. I called my old colleagues discreetly. I reconnected with Dr. Susan Roberts from Pacific General Neurology Specialist, trusted friend. I told her what was happening. She agreed to run a cognitive assessment quietly, just to prove the truth. "We'll make this official, Leonard," she said. "If she's building a lie about your mind, we'll dismantle it with facts." It was the first time in months I felt something close to hope. Grief still lived in me, but it had changed shape. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It was a fire burning quietly behind my ribs. Every night I'd talk to Grace's photo on the nightstand. "I'm still here," I'd say. "You were right about her, and I promise I won't let her win." There's a saying I used to teach my students when I trained new interpreters. The most powerful person in any conversation is the one who listens the longest. I finally understood what that meant. Because while Lydia talked herself into her own lies, I listened. While she played the devoted daughter-in-law, I recorded. While she built a world where I was the broken one, I built one where the truth had proof. And in that balance between sorrow and strategy, something inside me hardened, not cruelly, but necessarily. Revenge stopped being an act of rage and became an act of restoration. When the moment came and I knew it would, Lydia wouldn't face an angry old man. She'd face the quiet intelligence she underestimated. Grace used to say, "Love leaves echoes." I realized revenge does too. The only difference is that one heals the soul while the other defends it. So I waited, watching, listening, preparing. My tears had dried. My heart was steady. The grief that once silenced me had become my greatest ally. Because the next time Lydia called me the old fool, she wouldn't be talking to a broken man. She'd be talking to her executioner in silence. Revenge doesn't begin with anger, it begins with clarity. Once I understood what Lydia was doing every day became an operation. I wasn't just a widower anymore. I was an investigator, a strategist, a man reclaiming control over his own story. And if she thought my age made me slow, she was about to learn that experience doesn't fade, it sharpens. The first step was simple information. Lies thrive in darkness, and Lydia's whole game depended on no one comparing notes. I started logging everything: dates, times, conversations, even the smallest inconsistencies. The same precision I once used in medical interpretation now applied to every moment of my life. I kept a ledger disguised as a crossword puzzle notebook, each clue representing an incident, an unauthorized withdrawal, a forged signature, a suspicious phone call. Next came the recordings. The Sony ICD PX470 digital recorder became my most trusted ally, small enough to fit behind my shirt buttons, sharp enough to capture every word. I wore it everywhere: family dinners, bank meetings, doctor visits. Lydia had built her false narrative with whispers. I would destroy it with her own voice. One morning she walked in with her usual act of concern. "Dada, I noticed you forgot to take your pills again." Her tone dripped with practiced empathy. I let my hands tremble slightly, feigning forgetfulness. "Which ones, dear?" I asked. She smiled. "See, that's what I mean." Later, when I replayed the recording, I caught the exact shift in her tone, the smugness that slipped through for half a second when she thought I didn't notice. That sound became more satisfying than any victory, but evidence alone wasn't enough. I needed allies, people with authority, credibility, and clean reputations. I started with Dr. Susan Roberts, my longtime colleague and head of neurology at Pacific General. I told her everything: how Lydia had claimed I was showing signs of dementia, how she'd forged medical documentation to seize financial control. Susan listened silently, then said, "Leonard, you've spent your life helping people communicate truth. Now you're going to use that skill to expose deception." She arranged a full neurological evaluation, memory tests, reasoning assessments, cognitive exams, every detail meticulously documented. I passed all of them with flying colors. Susan signed and notarized every result herself. It wasn't just a medical report, it was a weapon. Next, I contacted James Mitchell, Grace's estate attorney of 22 years, a man with the patience of a judge and the loyalty of an old friend. When I told him what Lydia had done, how she'd filed a fraudulent power of attorney, his face hardened. "We'll need to move carefully," he said. "She's already established a legal narrative that paints you as incompetent. That gives her leverage in court. We'll dismantle it piece by piece." He advised me to gather corroborating witnesses, people who interacted with me regularly and could attest to my mental clarity. I reached out to Mrs. Patterson, my next-door neighbor, who said, "Leonard, you helped me set up my online banking last week. You're sharper than anyone I know." Then Tom Bradley, my financial advisor, who had records of our recent investment discussions. He even provided email transcripts showing I'd managed complex transactions myself. Each statement was a brick in the foundation of my defense, each recording another nail in Lydia's coffin. The turning point came when I requested bank statements from the past 6 months. Kevin, the young branch manager, was hesitant. "Mr. Gray, your daughter-in-law has been managing your accounts due to reported cognitive decline." I smiled. "Reported by whom?" He swallowed hard. "Ms. Chen, she filed documentation signed by your physician. I asked for a copy. When I saw the signature, I knew it was a forgery. Grace's name used as a witness months after she died." That was the first moment I truly allowed myself to feel anger. But anger, when refined, becomes precision. I photocopied everything and stored the originals in a safety deposit box at a separate bank under my name only. I told no one. Lydia thought she controlled my world, but in reality I was reconstructing it behind her back. By late September, I had 4 hours of recordings, medical proof, and legal witnesses. But I wanted one more thing, a public setting where Lydia's lies would collapse in front of her entire support network. She had built her empire of sympathy using her family in the local Chinese-American community. So I planned my counterattack right where she felt strongest. When she suggested a family intervention to discuss my supposed decline, I agreed instantly. "You're right, Lydia," I told her. "Maybe it's time the family got everything out in the open." She smiled, mistaking compliance for surrender. For 2 weeks, I prepared in silence. Susan agreed to attend, bringing her official medical results. Mitchell would stand by ready with Grace's will and financial documents. Even Dr. Peterson, the physician Lydia had falsely cited, confirmed by phone that he'd never diagnosed me with cognitive issues. The day of the intervention, I dressed in Grace's favorite gray suit, the one she'd always said made me look trustworthy and unshakable. Lydia's house smelled like jasmine and deceit. She had baked cookies, lit candles, played soft piano music, every detail calculated to make her appear compassionate. Around the table sat her parents, her sister Ivy, my son David, the grandchildren, and 3 members of the cultural association Lydia had charmed into believing her story. She began her speech with crocodile tears. "We're all here because we love Dad," she said. "His confusion is getting worse, and we just want what's best for him." Heads nodded. I stayed silent, hands folded. Then she started speaking Mandarin, thinking no one else understood. "He's going to fight me," she whispered, "but once the doctor confirms dementia, the inheritance will be mine to manage. The fool won't even know it's happening." That was my cue. I tapped my pocket gently. The recorder blinked red. Every word captured. Susan arrived 15 minutes later, her voice calm but firm. "I've evaluated Mr. Gray," she said, setting a folder on the table. "His cognitive function is excellent. He is of completely sound mind." Gasps filled the room. Lydia's smile faltered. Then I switched the recorder on. Her own voice filled the air, mocking, cruel, unmistakable. "The old fool won't even know it's happening." Her parents' faces turned pale. My son's hand froze midair. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. That was the first battle won. But I wasn't done yet. James Mitchell filed immediate motions to revoke the fraudulent power of attorney and freeze all joint accounts under investigation. Susan submitted her neurological report to the court. Dr. Peterson's statement confirmed the medical forgery. Within a week, the Department of Financial Crimes had opened a formal case. Lydia's confidence began to crumble. Her texts grew erratic. Her tone shifted from smug to desperate. I'd expected that. That's how manipulation ends, not with defiance, but with panic. I didn't need to raise my voice, didn't need to shout. I just kept presenting facts clean, clinical, irrefutable. Every lie she'd told now stood side by side, with her own voice admitting them. Revenge, I learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and the whisper is louder than a scream. By the time Lydia realized what I had built, it was too late. The documents, the witnesses, the recordings, all lined up like chess pieces. And the king she thought she'd cornered, he'd been playing a different game all along. The night of reckoning smelled like cinnamon and deceit. Lydia had arranged what she called a family dinner for healing, a final act in her theater of compassion. The dining room glowed under warm lights, the table dressed with Grace's old china. Ironic, really. that she'd used the very dishes my wife had loved to celebrate her own victory. Everyone was there: my son David, our grandchildren Ella and Noah, Lydia's parents, Maylin and Victor, her sister Ivy, and a few family friends she'd invited as witnesses of love. The illusion was perfect, except tonight the illusion would die. Lydia floated around the table in a cream silk blouse, playing the part of a dutiful daughter-in-law. She poured wine, smiled at me, even tucked my napkin under my plate, as if I were too fragile to do it myself. "Dad," she said sweetly, "we're all here because we love you. We just want to talk about your next steps." Her next steps, of course, meant signing away my financial autonomy and agreeing to assisted care. To her, this dinner was the final push before she claimed control of everything Grace and I had built over a lifetime. But to me, it was the last scene of a play I'd already rewritten. As everyone began eating, Lydia launched her speech, soft, persuasive, rehearsed to perfection. "It's been hard watching Dad struggle." She began, glancing around the table for sympathy. "His confusion has been getting worse. He forgets things. He repeats stories. He sometimes can't find the right words. I think we all agree it's time he moved somewhere safe." David nodded, uncomfortable but silent. He was still torn, half believing his wife, half clinging to the father he once knew. Ella and Noah sat quietly, sensing tension, but too young to understand it. I didn't interrupt. I let her dig deeper. Then Lydia turned to her mother and switched to Mandarin, assuming as always that her secret language would shield her cruelty. "He'll resist," she said softly, "but I've already spoken with the lawyer. Once I have power of attorney, everything transfers automatically. He's too senile to notice." Her mother hesitated. "Lydia, this feels wrong." Lydia's voice sharpened. "Mom, he's not family. He's a walking bank account. Once I have access, we can pay off the mortgage, buy the Tempe house, and finally live without stress." I let her finish the sentence. Then I set down my fork. "Lydia," I said gently, "would you mind repeating that in English for everyone?" The room froze. She blinked. "What are you talking about, Dad?" I smiled. "The part about me being a walking bank account." Her face drained of color. You misunderstood. I was just..." "In Mandarin," I interrupted. "No, I understood you perfectly." I switched languages, my tone calm but sharp as glass. "Ni yi wei wo ting dong. Dui ma, you thought I couldn't understand, didn't you?" The silence was absolute. Chopsticks clattered against porcelain. David's eyes widened in shock. I stood slowly. "For 30 years I worked as a medical interpreter. Mandarin, Cantonese, Taiwanese, and Shanghainese. I've spent my life helping people communicate across languages. And for the last 6 months, I've been listening to every word you've said." From my jacket pocket, I pulled out the small digital recorder, the same one she'd never noticed. I pressed play. Lydia's voice filled the dining room, bright and venomous. "The old fool is almost gone. Once I move him to assisted living, the inheritance will be mine." Her mother gasped. Her father muttered something under his breath. David's fork slipped from his hand. "Would anyone like a translation?" I asked quietly. Lydia stood up abruptly, trembling. "You can't use that. That's illegal recording, private conversations." "Not when they're conducted in my home," I said, my voice still calm. "Not when they involve financial fraud, forged medical documents, and a planned abuse of power of attorney." David turned to her, pale. "Lydia, what is this?" She reached for his arm, desperate. "David, please, he's confused. He doesn't know what he's doing." But I had come prepared for that too. From a leather folder I pulled Dr. Robert's official medical report, stamped and notarized. "This," I said, laying it on the table, "confirms that my cognitive function is entirely normal. No signs of dementia, no memory loss, no confusion. The only confusion in this family," I added, looking directly at Lydia, "is yours believing you could outsmart a man who spent his life listening for truth." Her face twisted, caught between rage and disbelief. "You set me up," she hissed in Mandarin. I replied in the same tongue voice, low but cutting, "No, Lydia. You set yourself up. I just pressed record." Her parents bowed their heads. Ivy started crying quietly. David pushed back his chair, staring at his wife as though seeing her for the first time. "I didn't want to believe Grace when she warned me about you," I said. "But she was right. She said you'd look at this family and see dollar signs. She said you'd try to steal the children's future." Lydia's composure shattered. "You all think I'm the villain," she screamed. "I was taking care of him. I handled everything while you—" David interrupted, his voice trembling with fury. "You lied to me. You forged signatures. You stole money meant for our kids. How could you?" I pressed play again, letting the next recording answer for me. Her voice again smug and unguarded. "Richard believes everything I tell him. Once I get power of attorney, the money will be easy to access. The stupid American doesn't understand a thing." This time no one moved. The weight of her words suffocated the room. Then came the final blow. The front door opened and James Mitchell Grace's attorney stepped inside holding a briefcase. "Good evening," he said smoothly. "Apologies for the interruption, but I was invited." Lydia's eyes darted between us, panic blooming. "What is this Mitchell placed documents on the table?" "Mrs. Gray's will. It explicitly forbids Lydia Chen, or any spouse thereof, from serving as trustee over the children's college funds." "And Mr. Gray," he added, turning to me, "I've filed motions to revoke the fraudulent power of attorney," Mrs. Chen submitted. "The court hearing is scheduled for Monday." It was over. The empire she'd built on manipulation collapsed right there between the dinner rolls and the wine glasses. Lydia sank into her chair, trembling. "You all set me up," she whispered. "No," I said softly. "You wrote your own ending. I just gave you an audience." I looked at David. "Son, do you finally see what she's done?" He nodded slowly, tears in his eyes. "I do, Dad. I see everything." For the first time in months, I felt the house breathe again. Grace's photo on the wall seemed to smile. As Lydia's parents stood to leave, her father said quietly, "We are ashamed." Then they walked out without looking back. The children clung to David, confused but comforted by his embrace. Lydia sat alone, staring at the recorder as if it were a weapon. And in a way it was. Not of violence, but of truth. Because tonight, truth had finally spoken in the only language she thought she could hide behind. And when I turned to her and said, "Zai zhenxiang mianqian, 每种语言都一样," in the face of truth, every language is the same, she knew it was over. That was the night the lies died. And the quiet man she called the fool finally had the last word. When the gavel struck, the sound didn't echo like punishment, it echoed like peace. After months of chaos, investigation, and court hearings, justice finally had a voice, and for once it wasn't mine. The courtroom was packed that morning. Rows of journalists, community members, and even hospital staff who'd known Lydia came to witness the verdict. The woman who once smiled her way through lies now sat in silence, her wrists cuffed, her designer clothes replaced by a plain gray suit. The mask was gone. The prosecutor read the charges, slowly letting each word cut through the room like a blade. Elder financial abuse, fraud, forgery, identity theft, falsification of medical documents. Lydia didn't flinch. She just stared at the table, her reflection small and broken in the polished wood. I sat behind my attorney, James Mitchell, calm but steady, every breath measured. For 6 months, I'd been portrayed as the senile old man, the confused widower who couldn't tell a checkbook from a telephone. Today, that illusion was dead. Dr. Susan Roberts testified, first confirming that my mental capacity was not just intact but exceptional. "Mr. Gray is of sound mind, emotionally stable, and cognitively strong for his age," she told the court. "He's a man who was systematically gaslighted and exploited under the guise of caregiving." Next came Detective Maria Santos from the Financial Crimes Unit. She played the recordings, each one like a nail in Lydia's coffin. Her voice filled the courtroom. "He's almost gone. Once I move him into assisted living, I'll have full control of the money." Gasps rippled through the audience. Even the judge's face tightened with disbelief. The evidence was airtight, forged signatures, verified by handwriting experts. Fake invoices from Taylor Care Management, LC emails, showing the attempted real estate purchase in Tempe, and witness statements from the Cultural Association she'd deceived. Lydia's own parents had written letters to the court condemning her actions. When her turn came to speak, Lydia tried to recover her old charm. "Your Honor," she said softly, "I was overwhelmed. I was caring for an elderly man alone. I made mistakes, but I never meant harm." Her voice quivered just enough to sound rehearsed. The judge, Patricia Coleman, leaned forward. "Mrs. Chen," she said, "you falsified medical records, defrauded your family, and exploited a grieving widower. You stole from funds meant for children's education and betrayed every principle of decency. This wasn't caregiving, it was calculated abuse. The sentence came down hard: 3 years in state prison, 5 years probation, restitution of $47,900 plus legal costs, and permanent prohibition from working with or managing the finances of elderly individuals. Lydia's nursing license was revoked on the spot by the Arizona State Board of Nursing. When the judge read that final clause, Lydia's composure cracked. Tears spilled not of remorse, but humiliation. The cameras caught everything. As the deputies led her away, she looked back at me, her eyes a mixture of hatred and disbelief. Maybe she expected me to smirk, to look triumphant. But I didn't. I just nodded once, as slow and deliberate. Revenge didn't need celebration, it just needed truth. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. "Mr. Gray, how does it feel to win?" one asked. I paused before answering. "It doesn't feel like winning," I said quietly. "It feels like surviving." What Lydia did wasn't just theft, it was betrayal. But betrayal can't destroy you if you face it with facts, not fury. Within days, the story went national. Elder abuse hidden in plain sight, the Phoenix Chronicle called it. Channel 12 News aired a special segment showing how I'd used recordings, documentation, and patience to dismantle a manipulator's empire. Commentators called it a masterclass in calm justice. I didn't care about titles or praise. All I wanted was for Grace's promise to be fulfilled, that our grandchildren's future would remain safe. The restitution money was deposited back into the college trust funds. With interest, the total reached $342,000, just as Grace had intended. David and I reopened communication. It wasn't easy. Guilt lingered between us like smoke after a fire, but love has its own quiet resilience. "Dad," he said one night, voice cracking, "I'm sorry I didn't see it. I should have protected you." I put a hand on his shoulder. "No, son. You believed the best in someone you loved. That's not a weakness, it's what makes us human." The community reaction was overwhelming. The Chinese Cultural Association issued a public apology for enabling Lydia's deception. In a remarkable act of restoration, they launched a fund in my name, the Leonard Gray Elder Protection Initiative, to help other seniors identify and report financial exploitation. Within a month, the program raised over $15,000, expanding statewide by the end of the year. Dr. Roberts invited me to speak at a medical conference in Scottsdale. My presentation was simple: a story about vigilance, silence, and self-respect. "People assume the elderly are helpless," I told the audience. "But the truth is, experience teaches you when to speak and when to let the evidence speak for itself." The hall rose to a standing ovation. As for Lydia, prison was only the beginning of her downfall. Her husband filed for divorce and was granted full custody of Ella and Noah. Her nursing license was permanently revoked, her record flagged nationwide. Every potential employer saw the same headline: "Nurse convicted in elder abuse case." 18 months later, I received a letter from her, handwritten, pleading for forgiveness. "Mr. Gray," it read, "I've lost everything. My career, my family, my reputation. Please, if you can find it in your heart, help me shorten my probation. I was desperate, not evil." I folded the letter neatly and set it aside. Some apologies aren't meant to be answered. Today, when people in the neighborhood wave to me, they don't see the confused old man Lydia invented. They see a man who stood his ground in silence until the truth spoke for itself. At church, parents introduced me to their children as the man who fought back with wisdom, not rage. I don't correct them. Grace would have smiled at that. Every Sunday, David and the kids visit. We cook together, play music, and sometimes practice Mandarin phrases. Ella once said, "Grandpa, can you teach us to say justice in Chinese?" I smiled and replied, "Gong zheng, gong zheng." She repeated it perfectly. That's the legacy Grace wanted. Not money, not revenge, but integrity passed down like language. And when I walk past the courthouse now, I don't feel bitterness. I feel purpose. Because Lydia's story isn't just hers, it's a warning. Evil doesn't always come with threats or weapons. Sometimes it comes with a smile, a gentle tone, and a forged signature. But I also learned something else: truth has patience. You don't have to shout to win. Sometimes you just have to listen, document, and let silence do the heavy lifting. Grace once told me the world respects quiet strength. She was right. Now when people call me the man who turned silence into justice, I simply nod. Because revenge didn't restore my faith in humanity, truth did. Forgiveness doesn't arrive with fireworks. It comes quietly like dawn after a storm. Months had passed since Lydia's sentencing, and though the court had restored my freedom, the silence at home felt different now. It wasn't heavy with grief anymore. It was full of unfinished conversations of words David and I hadn't yet found the courage to say. Every scar of betrayal leaves an echo, and for us that echo sounded like distance. David visited often after the trial, but his footsteps always carried guilt. I could hear it in the way he hesitated before knocking, see it in how he lingered at the door instead of walking straight in. For years he'd believed in Lydia's version of me, the frail old man losing his mind, and I could tell that realization haunted him. Guilt is a quiet prison, and he was serving time in his own. One afternoon he came by carrying a box. "Dad," he said softly, "I found this while packing up the house." Lydia never opened it. Inside were Grace's old recipe cards, her handwriting neat and graceful. My throat tightened as I read the top one lemon pie. Leonard's favorite. Grace used to bake that pie every Sunday. "She kept these all along," I murmured. David looked down. I think she was trying to remember what love looked like. We stood there for a moment, two men bound by regret and memory. Finally, David spoke what had been hanging in the air for months. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't protect you. I believed her lies because it was easier than questioning them. She made me feel like I was being a good husband by doubting my own father." I didn't answer right away. Forgiveness isn't a switch, it's a process. I poured us both coffee the way Grace used to and sat across from him. "You were blinded by love," I said gently. "That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." Lydia manipulated everyone, not just me. He shook his head. "But you tried to warn me. You even hinted things weren't right, and I told you you were confused. I can't forgive myself for that." I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "Then let me forgive you instead. You can't rewrite the past, son, but you can learn to listen differently." That's when I realized the true revenge wasn't in Lydia's conviction, it was in our restoration. Evil had fractured our family, but truth had given us a second chance. After the trial, the community began to change too. The Chinese Cultural Association, the same group Lydia had deceived, invited me to speak at their monthly meeting. When I walked into the hall, dozens of faces turned toward me, some familiar, other strangers who had followed the case through the news. Mrs. Chen, who once defended Lydia, approached with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Gray," she said in Mandarin, "we were wrong. You turned silence into a language we finally understood." That night I spoke about more than betrayal. I spoke about awareness, about how manipulation often hides behind politeness. Don't let pity replace truth, I told them. If someone tells you an elder is confused, ask questions. Listen carefully. Sometimes what you call confusion is just the sound of someone being silenced. The room went quiet, not out of discomfort, but reverence. It wasn't a speech, it was a bridge. Word spread quickly. Churches, hospitals, and community centers started inviting me to share my story. Not as a victim, but as a witness. I became part of a statewide initiative to train caregivers and families to detect financial manipulation. The Leonard Gray Elder Protection Fund raised enough to support dozens of victims who had been too afraid to speak out. Some called me a hero. I wasn't. I was just a man who refused to let silence become consent. Through it all, David began to heal too. He joined me at events, sitting in the audience, listening not to defend or explain, but to understand. I'd see him wiping his eyes when I spoke about grace, or when I told people how easy it is to mistake control for care. After one speech, he came up to me and said, "I finally get what Mom meant when she said you had the kind of strength that doesn't need to raise its voice." It was true. Grace had seen that in me long before I did, and now David was beginning to see it too. He even started teaching Ella and Noah small acts of empathy, helping neighbors, writing thank you letters to teachers, volunteering at the hospital where Grace used to work. "If we're going to carry your legacy, Dad," he said one day, "it has to be through kindness with boundaries." Meanwhile, the community that had once pitied me began to look at me with respect. People would stop me in grocery stores, on sidewalks, in the church parking lot. "You gave us courage," they'd say. "You made us pay attention." There was something sacred about that, knowing that my pain had become someone else's warning. But the most profound moment of reconciliation came one evening when David brought Ella and Noah over for dinner. We made Grace's lemon pie together. The kids laughed as flour dusted the kitchen counter, and David leaned against the doorway smiling. "She'd love this," he said softly. I nodded. She would. After dinner, as the children played, David and I sat on the porch. The air was cool, the Arizona sky streaked with violet and gold. "Dad," he said, "I used to think strength meant talking louder. You taught me it means listening longer." I smiled, my eyes on the fading horizon. "Listening has saved my life more than once." He nodded. "I want to do the same for my kids, to teach them to question things, to protect what's right without losing their hearts." That night I realized something that Grace had known all along. Justice isn't about punishment. It's about balance. Lydia's downfall had restored more than money or reputation. It had rebuilt something fragile but necessary, our trust. When I walked David and the kids to their car, Ella looked up and said, "Grandpa, what does truth mean in Chinese again?" I smiled. "Zhenxiang, Zhenxiang." It means something that always finds its way home. As they drove away, I stood under the porch light, feeling the warmth of forgiveness settle in like an old friend. I wasn't the broken man Lydia had painted me to be. I wasn't even the avenger I'd become during the fight. I was something simpler, purer, a man at peace with his own silence. Because sometimes reconciliation doesn't need words. It just needs presence. The quiet understanding that truth once spoken doesn't divide. It heals. The sun rose like forgiveness, slow, golden, and absolute. Morning light spilled through the kitchen window, warming the pages of Grace's old notebook as Ella and Noah leaned over the table, pencils in hand. "Okay," I said, pointing to the first word. "This one means truth. Say it with me, Zhenxiang, Zhenxiang." Their young voices echoed softly, full of innocence and curiosity. I smiled. That word had cost our family everything and given us everything back. Every Saturday at dawn, we met like this, 3 generations, one promise. I'd teach them a new Chinese phrase, and they'd teach me how to live without fear again. Today's lesson wasn't just about language, it was about legacy. Grace used to say that understanding someone's words is the first step to understanding their heart. Now my grandchildren were learning not just to speak, but to listen to people, to silence, to the truths hiding in between. As the light grew brighter, Ella looked up and asked Grandpa, "How do you say revenge in Chinese?" I paused and said quietly, "Fu cho fu cho." "But you know what's stronger than revenge." She tilted her head. I smiled. "Silence." Noah frowned playfully. "But silence isn't doing anything." I shook my head. "That's where people are wrong. Silence doesn't mean weakness, it means control. When you're quiet, you can see who's lying, who's loyal, and who only loves the sound of their own voice." They nodded slowly, as if understanding more than I expected. Outside, the world was waking up, birds calling, cars passing, the hum of another ordinary day. But in that little kitchen, everything felt eternal. I looked at them and said, "Remember this, sometimes silence is the loudest form of revenge. You don't always have to shout to win. The truth has its own voice, it just waits for the right moment to speak." Ella grinned. "Like you did with Grandma's recordings," I laughed softly. "Exactly. Except now I don't record lies anymore. I record memories." The morning sun hit Grace's photograph on the wall, her smile glowing in the golden light. And for the first time, I felt her peace settle fully over us. The pain was gone. The lesson remained. I closed my notebook and said, "That's enough learning for today. You know what the most important word in any language is?" Noah raised his hand. "Love close," I said. "It's respect, because love without respect turns into control, and respect begins when you learn to listen before you speak." They both nodded, and I knew Grace would have been proud. I turned toward the camera, the same one I used to document my truth, and spoke not as a victim, but as a reminder. Wherever you're watching this from, remember, betrayal doesn't define you. What you choose to do after it does. Speak when it matters, stay silent when it counts, and never let anyone convince you that calm means powerless. Because the quiet ones, the ones who observe, who think, who wait, are the ones who change everything. Then I leaned forward, lowering my voice as if sharing a secret. If this story spoke to something inside you, if you've ever been underestimated, betrayed, or silenced, don't leave it here. Leave your truth in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Hit save so you remember that strength doesn't always roar, and subscribe if you believe that justice can come without shouting. I smiled as the sun finally broke across the table, turning the Mandarin characters into glowing gold. Because one day I said someone will try to steal your peace too, when they do stay silent long enough for the truth to echo. And when it does, let it be louder than any lie ever told.